Before proceeding with my extra content for the original Fatal Frame, I did want to at least do one more character study of a pretty influential figure from the fourth entry in the series, Mask of the Lunar Eclipse. For that game, in addition to my usual review, I did a backstory video and a character study of the true protagonist Ruka Minazuki. While it may be fruitful to examine some of the other central characters such as Misaki Aso and Madoka Tsukimori, I think the character study I absolutely have to do is of the game's central antagonist, Sakuya Haibara. Sakuya Haibara is the daughter of Dr. Shigeto Haibara, a man who has devoted his entire life to the treatment of Moonlight Syndrome. More to the point, Sakuya is the main vengeful spirit haunting the halls of the Haibara Institute and Rogetsu Hall, and we come to learn that she has a pretty well-established reason for doing so, which speaks to some excellent writing. For starters, when her Moonlight Syndrome symptoms become incredibly bad, Dr. Haibara decided it was high time to lock her away in an isolation chamber for her own protection, as well as for the protection of others, especially Misaki Aso, one of the main characters of the game and someone who developed an unnaturally close connection to Sakuya. Additionally, she eventually completely blossomed as a result of a failed rite of descent, which is no joke. As we came to learn in the backstory video, her blossoming during the surreptitious revival of the taboo rite caused the death of nearly every inhabitant of Rogetsu Isle, an event known as the Second Day of Tranquility. This is substantiated by the following in-game article, appropriately titled, Islanders Found Dead. Quote, at approximately 4:30 p.m. yesterday, the captain of the Oberomaru docked at Rogetsu Isle reported the deaths of multiple Rogetsu Islanders. All of the bodies were found with their hands covering their faces. No survivors found. Faced with nothing to go on but the sudden disappearance of the island's population, when without any evidence of natural disasters, the police remain baffled by the bizarre incident. So, based on this article, a whole bunch of people wound up dead and presumably more vanished without a trace. Freaky deaky! There's another article entitled Rogetsu Disappearances that seems to corroborate the first article referenced. In the second one, the unknown author speculates that the mass disappearance of seemingly all Rogetsu Isle inhabitants whose bodies were never found could reasonably be explained by a mass outbreak of Moonlight Syndrome. Though this article is mostly speculative in nature and doesn't evince a complete understanding of the events that unfolded on that fateful day, the unknown author does come eerily close to the truth of what happened on that day. These two articles are supposed to plant the seed in the player's mind that Moonlight Syndrome and the mass disappearances are somehow related. But let's get back to Sakuya and her role in all of this. Her father, Dr. Shigeto Haibara, had selected Sakuya to be the vessel for the revived rite of descent because he desperately hoped it would cure her worsening case of Moonlight Syndrome once and for all. Through in-game documents, we come to learn that Sakuya's mother actually ended her own life as a result of her own Moonlight Syndrome and also because she, quote, blamed herself for her daughter's illness, end quote. Dr. Haibara knew the same fate that befell his wife awaited his and his wife's beloved daughter if he didn't act. And he goes on in this note to say that, quote, everything I've done, my work, my sacrifices, the culmination of my research, it's all for her, end quote. Here, Dr. Haibara is referring to his wife. He understood that she couldn't bear to look at what Moonlight Syndrome was doing to Sakuya and chose death instead. And for her sake, Dr. Haibara vowed to cure Sakuya by any means necessary. He believed that the secret to curing this condition lay in the taboo rite of descent. Hence Sakuya's central role in this ritual and the increasing severity of Dr. Haibara's inhumane experimentation on other patients in this institute plagued by the disease. And just as with Ruka, we discover that Sakuya has a deep-seated connection to the first recorded Day of Tranquility through her ancestral lineage. As mentioned in Haibara's Note 1, Dr. Haibara himself comes from, quote, an esteemed lineage of head ceremonial priests, end quote. We come to learn that the Haibara family have long presided over the rites on Rogetsu Isle as priests. This aligns with the dev's choice to depict Dr. Haibara in his fateful ghost battle with Choshiro, wearing ceremonial garb to emphasize the importance of that lineage. In normal ghostly encounters with him, Dr. Haibara is wearing his regular work clothes. This attention to detail works exceedingly well. Now, unlike with Ruka, we don't really get a whole lot of concrete detail beyond that, but this one note situates Dr. Shigeto Haibara in a very interesting relational positioning within this complicated web. Due to his strong ties to the religious side of things, as well as his expertise as a man of medicine, Dr. Haibara sees himself as a bridge between Moonlight Syndrome's spiritual and scientific components. In fact, he sees the marriage of the sacred and the secular as the only way forward. Evidence for this comes from Haibara's assistant's Note 1, which states that Haibara, quote, has taken a unique approach to treating Moonlight Syndrome, incorporating the folklore of the island. Treatments such as musical therapy using the traditional Rogetsu Isle moon sounds are unheard of in conventional psychiatry, end quote. In the second note, his assistant alludes to surgical procedures also being part of the treatment methodology, which makes me think of such grotesque practices as lobotomy. As a side note, not only was this really smart writing for Dr. Haibara's character, but it's also the perfect recipe for a refreshing take on the mad scientist trope. And in fact, as we might expect, Dr. Haibara's methods start to become more and more warped as his obsession grows. They become less and less rooted in medical science and much more grounded in folklore, which never goes horribly awry. Nope. As mentioned in the backstory video, through the noblest of intentions, Dr. Haibara becomes obsessed with conducting inhumane tests on the patients at his institute in order to poke and prod at the very fabric of Moonlight Syndrome. I can understand his compelling motivation, which goes a long way toward making him the interesting villain he needs to be in order to set us up for the true antagonist. All he wants to do is save his daughter Sakuya, and he will stop at absolutely nothing. Though his son Yo Haibara may be outright evil, Dr. Haibara is more complicated, and you can at least sympathize with him a little bit. Be that as it may, he still gives the order to kidnap 5 young girls, 3 of them receiving inpatient care and 2 of them receiving outpatient care, and subject them to the consequences of another failed rite of descent. When we come to realize through the events of the game, this iteration of the rite of descent caused a calamity for a second time in recorded Rogetsu history. A direct descendant of the ceremonial mask maker thought to be responsible for the first failed rite, Soya Yamotsuki thought he could avoid his predecessor's error in crafting the true mask of the lunar eclipse, which he, Dr. Haibara, and Dr. Haibara's son thought was the key to performing a successful rite of descent and curing Moonlight Syndrome. What they failed to consider was the importance of the lunar melody that had to be played at the altar, of which they only had fragments unearthed with the help of Dr. Kunihiko Aso's camera obscura. During her performance, Sakuya experienced moonlust and lost herself completely. She blossomed and caused a resonance that resulted in the 5 organs in her own dance, as well as the dancers in the public-facing Rogetsu Kagura taking place simultaneously to stop suddenly and faint. Performers of the Rogetsu Kagura would not reawaken, and the 5 organs who had been kidnapped by Yo Haibara and forced to participate in Sakuya's ritual would awaken, but without their memories. Sakuya would fall into a coma. After this catastrophic turn of events, Sakuya was locked away in the Court of the Unhallowed, as substantiated in patient observation record, with only one on-duty nurse to watch over her. Though she is unconscious, we learn that she exercises a supernatural influence over the inhabitants of the Haibara Institute. For starters, Yuko Magaki starts having prophetic visions of apocalyptic proportions about the 5 organs in Sakuya. In his second painting note, in which he talks about his painting titled 5 Girls Seeking Light, he says, quote, "It depicts those naive and foolish girls crying for help while oblivious to their crime." End quote. A little later on, things take a dramatically macabre turn when he states the following, quote, "These visions are the flowers of salvation. Yes, they bring about the salvation that we have been waiting for. We will all be saved by our own annihilation. Bright, blinding annihilation will bloom over this island. Stop ye and witness the flower woman. See her face filled with the beauty of annihilation." End quote. Obviously, Magaki is referring to the 5 kidnapped girls being complicit in the chain of events that set into motion the resonance that entirely wipes out Rogetsu Isle. He then goes on to praise Sakuya for bringing about salvation to the people of the island through annihilation. This is interesting, and it's actually something that Soya Yamotsuki started to believe as he thought more and more about why his version of the rite of descent failed. He and others affected by moonlust start to believe that blossoming is actually the desired end result that allows for a truly harmonious existence. Though I do have a penchant for nihilism, this is even a bit much for me. In addition to Magaki's contributions, we learned some horrifying things from the on-duty nurse, Shie Sonosaki, who was assigned to watch over Sakuya. Shie says, quote, "This infirmary has been getting stranger and stranger every day since she was taken down to the Court of the Unhallowed. For one thing, they aren't letting us nurses bring the patient her meals. There are non-infirmary staff handling that. Strange people wearing masks." End quote. Well, this is a big ol' red flag. Dr. Haibara is bringing in strange people who may or may not be medically qualified to bring his comatose daughter her meals. Now keep in mind that because Sakuya is comatose at this point, it would actually require medical training to handle the equipment that would presumably be used to feed the patient intravenously. So this is extra weird that the only one officially on the medical staff assigned to this patient wouldn't handle this, and instead, fucking randos would get to do it. On top of that, Shie actually asks Dr. Haibara who the F these people are, and he brushes her off. Yikes. But probably the most interesting thing we learn from this spiritually sensitive nurse comes from her first note, in which she says, quote, "I know she's alive behind that door, but looking at these numbers, there's no way that could possibly be true. Even so, this feeling that she's going to wake up one day is bothering me. As a nurse, I know I should be pleased when my patients recover, and yet my heart trembles in fear." End quote. Holy cow. This is so fucking creepy, and Sakuya is such a ghastly force to be reckoned with that she causes people to have apocalyptic visions as well as powerful premonitions about her. Again, I've got to praise the writing. This is how you do ghosts right. After 2 years in her purgatorial state, Sakuya awakens and causes the calamity known as the Second Day of Tranquility, which results in the deaths and mass disappearances of all who inhabit Rugetsu Isle. But it doesn't stop there. Her malevolent influence causes the death of 2 of the organs from the failed rite of descent and haunts the remaining 3 until they have no choice but to come back to the place where it all began. Anyway, that's gonna do it for this one. I'm going to be doing some deep dives for the first Fatal Frame since I've started that playthrough, but I may come back to this game and do some additional deep dives. You'll just have to wait and see.